one of the reasons that I love to come down to the Austin events is seeing the next generation of folks in the vampire community doing what I've always wanted folks in the vampire community to be doing.
Yes.
And so I wanted to talk a little bit about history and where we come from, and also where I see us going, and how proud I am of that. While I was sitting here thinking about it, I first started calling myself a vampire in 1979. And it stuck. Like, that was, you know how a lot of people have the coming out thing of like, you know, I'm 6 or 7, I realize that I'm this. So I was in first grade, and I invented a game called Vampire Tag, and I fully knew what I was doing to my friends when I fought them. Fully knew. It obviously took me a while to like really sort out like what that meant. So I didn't find the vampire community as such until 1991. And that was when I went out to college. I had grown up in a very small town, so I was like the one, well, it was a weird town, so there were a lot of weird kids, but I was like the cream of the crop of the I was also a National Merit Scholar, so like my high school didn't help me at all with being the weird kid, because like they did this thing where like I did a thing on like migraines for one of my classes, and they held it up as, if you could do better than this, we'll give you an A. But like they included my name, so everybody hated me. So I go off to college after being in this fairly small, you know, semi-rural Ohio town, where like I'd read everything I could get my hands on. I was reading the Bhagavad Gita, Taoist texts, like things where I started to realize that there were other cultures and other people who believed in such a thing as energy. This thing that I was aware that I could take, that I could feel, that I could sense. And I ran across the writings of a woman, Dion Fortune, which was the first place I saw the word psychic vampire. And while I disagreed heartily with all of her problems with the psychic vampires in her world, because her whole text was all about psychic self-defense. In her idea, psychic vampires, anybody who was vampiric was just an asshole. Like they were predators. They were things to be protected against. Well, and that's the thing. Is like there isn't. We can't deny the predatory nature. But what she was writing about, her experiences had been 100% negative. And we all know the type of people that she was describing. You know, as somebody that was a dominating personality who knew all the right buttons to push to get a strong emotional reaction out of people, managed to keep them under their thumb, and just really wrecked her. And one of the motivations for her to learn a lot of the energy work and psychic self-defense that she developed was to protect herself against this person who was, I believe, her boss for a while. So she had strong opinions, but no, she wasn't the person who coined the term psychic vampire. And I went on a magic mystery tour to try to figure out like where it comes from. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky is generally like one of the people credited with it. What I can say for sure is 19th century occultists, that's probably where psychic vampire comes from. But of course, obviously, the idea of the vampire comes long before that. But that's vampire in fiction and folklore and literature and magical stuff. Like, knowing that it existed what was enough to make me go, okay, I'm not completely crazy, but I'm pretty sure I'm still alone. Like, I don't know anybody else who's like me. Because this is long before the internet. But it was in the heyday of something called zines. Now, these were things that were used in the punk.
All the old people.
These were our message boards, but it was pen and paper. You'd go down, you'd run stuff off on Xerox. The punks started it. The goth scene picked it up. Pretty much all of alternative culture. And it's fascinating now because there are actually like college books that are being published by university presses studying the zine phenomenon. And how this was like the life's blood, the way in which these subcultures stayed in contact. And they were usually some enterprising soul who was furiously cutting and pasting random shit together and making a little booklet and having like this sort of like pen pal network that it all went out to. And if you were really lucky, there was like maybe a consignment store owner who was open-minded who would also carry your thing. And I first ran across zines when I went to LaGrange Con with a fellow who I didn't realize was trying to date me, but that's my own problem. I like boys, I like girls, I just didn't like him. years. And they had a little free thing out, and everybody had all sorts of stuff. And oh, this is super awesome. There's a thing for Beauty and the Beast with Vincent. There's that's more Vincent than I ever wanted to see, because it was a fan convention. I got to learn what slash meant. Kirk / Spock. I was super interested into that until I realized what it meant. But I found one zine called Necropolis, which immediately grabbed me because Chad Savage used, there was a fellow who was illustrating Dante's Inferno, and he used that as the backdrop for all of these, super, cut yourself in the corner goth poetry. I mean, it was super, but it was right up my alley at the time, and there was vampires. At this time, I was also a budding writer and trying to get in contact with publishers, and all of them were no vampires, just no vampires. They had been Anne Riced to death, and they just didn't want to hear it. So what I ended up doing in 1991 was starting a magazine called Shadow Dance, which was ostensibly just gothic literary, if you want to write about vampires and poetry and fiction, whatever, send me your stuff and I will do this. So I ran this thing out of my dorm room for 4 years because my college was not nearly as challenging as I expected it to be. It was Jesuit Catholic, they talked themselves up, it was a full ride, so whatever. But in communicating with people who were writing fiction about vampires, writing poetry about vampires, I started to also communicate with them, because I'd see little things that were this seems too close to the real thing. And, I'd write a little, pen pal letter of, hey, you're submitting to the thing, and what inspired this weird bit about this energy exchange thing? And they're like, okay, this is gonna sound crazy, but. At that time, Temple of the Vampire was the only thing that I knew that was an organization that was advertising, I think as early as 1989 in Heavy Metal Magazine. There were, and that kind of tells you what audience they were going for. There were a couple of other little isolated things, but for the most part, everybody was independent, and if you were kind of a vampire community, it was, let's see, there was the Vampire Information Exchange Network, which was mostly intended to be vampire fandom. But that's where also some real vampires were communicating with one another. It turned into kind of like a vampire personals thing. Single white vampire looking for a victim. Oh god, no, and it was exactly that bad. It was really that bad.
I know, marketing going, here we go.
Well, and at that point, because again, pre-internet, pre-ability to swiftly fact-check anything, you're writing it to one another from across the country via snail mail, and trust me, there were plenty of, I am a 5,000-year-old vampire. I live in a crypt in my mom's basement.
It turned into a bat.
Yeah, I drink 5 pints of blood a day, and and completely overblown. And then you'd find
I don't
the ones.
like anyone enough to take in that much of it.
Yeah, seriously.
How many of them invested in the stock market?
Anybody who asks me that, I say, how the hell do you not have a prion disease by now?
Yeah, no, just so there was a fair amount of bullshit. I mean, they were the same kind of people who were also trying to tell me that they had a real copy of the Necronomicon. So that trying to swim through the crap, that was real.
Was it Bruce Campbell? I have a feeling it was Bruce Campbell.
I've got a funny story about him at a convention. Not because of vampires. In the course of all of this pen pal stuff and the kind of behind the scenes stuff behind Shadow Dance, it started to be obvious that there needed to be a community. That there were people who wanted a community, some of whom had been kind of finding outlets for who they were and acceptance in the BDSM community, some who were in the goth community, some who were in the LARPing community, and anywhere where you could find vampires, you found folks who secretly were vampires and were just looking for some way where they were not stigmatized. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is at the tail end of the Satanic Panic, which was wearing black, you were too black in neighborhoods. Like, yeah, I mean, you're just I mean, like where I grew up was like so white bread. There was, by the time I graduated high school, there was one fellow who was lighter than a paper bag. One. And so like, if you stood out with anything, like they looked for things to make you stand out. And goth, I remember friends getting picked up on the street just because they were wearing trench coats.
Yes.
Especially like post-Columbine. We did it, I helped run an event in 1999, I think that was when the Columbine thing happened. It was called Sanctuary at the big goth club, well, as big as it's gonna get in Cleveland. And it was unfortunately 2 weeks after Columbine, and I swear to God, we had more undercover cops there than we had attendees. They were just waiting for us to shoot the place up. So we were.
Did they pay?
They did.
Good.
So at that point, fine. That's cool.
It's like a tax refund. Almost.
Yeah, give me. Quit trying to feel up the girls, you know. So in this stew of these other little seed communities, we started to kind of pop our heads up and go, hey, are you? Are you? One of the main places that I use to make contact, and I never make any bones about this. I know that some people have like the you role play dirty shame, but I ran Vampire the Masquerade LARPs for Wizards of the Coast at Origins and Gen Con for many years. And what I would absolutely shamelessly do was write real magic and real occultism into all the stuff and character. It basically made dog whistles throughout the fucking game. And just waited to see like who was like, huh? Where did you get this idea for this character? And I'm like, so we're gonna have a meeting in RPHQ after the game. No role playing, just come as yourself and let's talk. The other thing was at the time, everybody, because we were all like little isolated things, nobody had common language. Everybody, if anything, you borrowed it from stuff. So you had Anne Rice language, you had role-playing language, and you know, we were just we were groping toward a cultural identity. At that time, I think the hardest thing was we were so aware that we didn't belong. We knew people who'd had their kids taken away because they were vampires and they were outed. We knew people who were in jail because they were vampires and they were outed. Damien Eccles on fucking death row because he was a magical practitioner and a vampire who drank blood. His town knew it, and when 3 murders happened, they got pinned on him. You probably know him better with the West Memphis 3.
Yep.
Trust me, I was floored when I got a text. He tweeted at me when he got out, about a year after acclimated. It seemed like the most ridiculous tweet. It was like, I just want you to know that your books helped save my life when I was on death row. And I'm like, okay, what bullshit is this? But why is that name familiar? So knowing that there were high-profile folks, that there were low-profile folks, that there were our people who had all sorts of horrible shit happen to them just because of who they were, that they wanted to live as who they were, dress as who they were. I can't count the number of kids who were beaten up and kicked out of their parents' house because they wanted to be who they were, and goth was satanic, and being a vampire was satanic. I knew one guy who still had scars from being held down with a Bible thumped into his head over and over and over again as they tried to exorcise him. So, yeah, and it's infuriating. In that milieu, when we started to organize, we felt like we really didn't have a right to be a real business, to seek protection, to handle anything but handle our own shit. If something happened, we would sweep it under the rug. We wouldn't talk about it. We would try to deal with it within the club or within the community. When I think in some cases we probably should have gone to the police, but we had every reason to distrust them. Flash forward several years as various communities around the country all start to develop. And they each have the DNA of the groups that they started off in, and they each very much have the DNA of the regions in which they're developing. But we start to actually communicate, first in zines and like by snail mail, and then this magical internet thing happens. And I remember when I found the AOL chat room, Real Vampires No RPG, which if you're old enough, you know it. I was at work, I was working at Booksellers, an independent bookstore in Cleveland, and I was in charge of the magazine periodical section. They were looking to like do kind of like this strange, cutting-edge internet cafe thing. So my job for several weeks was to go online and understand the internet and go into chat rooms and see what the appeal was, and then report back. So pretty much I'm just sitting there like, oh, you need to buy that? Fine. So seriously, who are you? Blah, blah, blah. I was under the ID Lady Uriel, which I quickly found putting a lady in front of your name for shit on the internet, especially at that point, was just bad news. I learned what cybering was real quick. Switched to a different handle, also really quick. But also started to find the people who would become elders, even though like that word is a charged word, because anybody can stand up and say, I am Lord blah blah blah, whatever blah blah blah, and after a while they just start to sound like Vlad Nader in his basement. But when I call someone an elder, what I mean is somebody who is an actual mover and shaker, somebody who was like, you know what, I am going to try to help nurture what I can, if not in real space, meat space around me, then in a virtual space, a place where I can host a website and try to weed out the bullshit and help people get answers, like Sanguinarius, rest in pieces wherever you're at.
Right.
Drink deeply and dream.
Yeah, drink. Well, they're not.
They're not around anymore.
Yeah, no, they're not around anymore. Let me see. When I first found the vampire websites, it was the coven.org, which I heard all kinds of things about. There was sanguinarius.org, there was Sphinx Cat, and I did not run into Drink Deeply and Dream until a year or two later. This was ironically 1997, which was, I say ironically because it was the
2003 for me.
The anniversary of the publication of Dracula is when like all of these things just sort of like blew up on the internet, not because it was connected to Dracula, just that was when everybody started to get access. When people started to have like enough money for computers to actually be there. So a lot of the stuff that had been happening kind of like haltingly in space, like we would run a little event here. I did a lot of like salon style soirees. So I had a house, and anybody who was into stuff, it wasn't just exclusively vampires. You'd come over, we'd hang out. Sometimes it would be a back rub circle, sometimes it would be a fire pit in the backyard, and always we would be talking about energy work. And like they are some of the most like those wonderful, intense moments, those conversations that you have when you realize that you can strip away all the bullshit and just be who you are. And at least where I was at, that was how it came together. We didn't have any kind of good clubs to like really start socializing at that. So we had to have a space where we could just be like you, and you, and try to get the word out. And I'd hear whispers about a New York community, and we all thought that New Orleans was Mecca, like fucking Mecca. We could go on pilgrimage. I know.
No, I thought the same crap.
I know. And then one of the guys I went to college with, it was Toronto, and like he went on up and like because there was a goth store up there. It was pretty much there was a music store he was going for. And Patrick Rogers starts running his Dracula's balls, and there's all of this like little flashpoints. So how we get to where we're at right now is there, it blew up. Like it blew up in good ways and bad ways. We suddenly were not just a community, like we were all over the internet. There was a ridiculous amount of shit on Facebook and chat rooms and message boards. I won't even get into the psychic, sang, meta-sang, like all of the different terms, because I will say like me and Sanguinarius, we threw down. Like we flame warred one another for the longest damn time, because initially, to call yourself a vampire, when I came on the scene, the idea of a psychic vampire, people were like, that's bullshit. A vampire just drinks blood. The psychic stuff, that's just woo-woo weird stuff. But we started to just communicate with one another. And in that communication, like finding the common bond between this archetype, this being, is something that hits me right here. It lives in me. It's something that, you know, I learned to respect the folks who dress the part, because it's masking. It's a magical archetype. It's really no different from drawing down the moon. You are taking not a god or a goddess, but in many ways, like pop culture, the pop culture figures that we have are the same thing. They all tap into powerful archetypes. So, like, I had disdain for lifestylers at first, but when I saw that this was something that, like, empowered a person, and that the vampire was no less sacred to them, just because their expression of it, their experience of it was slightly different from mine. This is how we started to come together and do things like Kovica, which was an early vampire council, Neutral Ground. There were half a dozen other initiatives, and let me tell you, we've all been trying to reinvent the wheel since we started to actually be a community, which is to say that everybody kind of wants to have some way of getting everybody to communicate with one another and play nice when you've got a ridiculous number of very strong personalities, many of whom all want to be in charge, or certainly have the attitude of "you're not the boss of me."
Well, look at the motivation.
Torpor, bitch.
But the people who stood out and the people that I saw again and again and again were the ones who the politics just made them tired. What they really wanted was a community that was productive for everybody. You could see who those people were over time. They revealed themselves over time. You know, I can't count the number of, you know, I am the lord of the vampire community and I'm going to run everything. I can't count the number of them that came, showed up, made a lot of noise, and disappeared because they thought that being in charge of shit meant that everybody just followed you because you said you were cool, and that it wasn't work.
We're tired, Bailey.
But the people who actually got that, like, leadership means that you are in service to a community. Leadership means that you are trying to bring everybody up, even if you don't agree with what they're doing, as long as it's safe, sane, and consensual, that we're all in this together, that we're all trying to support one another. And, you know, back in the day, we used to joke, we're like, where are the 40 and 50-year-old vampires? Where are the 60-year-old vampires? I can tell you as a 40-pushing, 50-year-old vampire, I know where they go now. We get fucking tired.
I thought you were going to say there's like a vampire retirement home.
You know, well, I will say, and I don't think I'm giving anything away with this. Patrick Rogers at one point quipped that he was, because he has permanent fangs.
Right.
He had joked that he wants to make sure he makes enough money so that when he is old and bald and looks like Nosferatu because of the permanent fangs, that he can just pay for the most beautiful nurses in his nursing home.
I had the same dream.
Yeah.
No shit.
The thing is what, maybe 10 years ago or so, like it started to kind of, I don't know, get stale. Some of it was Facebook, some of it was, a lot of the people who I knew as movers and shakers had gotten tired of having the same fights, of trying to, like, throw the flag on the field for one or two problem people who just don't seem to ever go away. And, you know, I watched more and more of them, and a few people died. I mean, Sanguinarius is dead. Mary Lapierre is not dead, but she's in enough ill health that, like, she's very much, like, cut down what she does. Murticus, not ill health, but, like, Murticus is so burnt out.
He's so done.
So fucking burnt out. Like, he's just kind of, like, dipped his toe back in to go, okay, are we still crazy? Oh, God. But then what I saw was, you know, those of us who'd written stuff, and those of us who'd built stuff, and those of us who had supported websites for years and just done this labor of love, enough time had passed that people who grew up on what we were doing, who found it when they were like 12 or 13, who found it when they were 15, 16,
Hey.
times when I would have given my eye teeth for resources like this. They found it, and we did what we were supposed to do, which was knock down some of the walls, and, you know, that involved banging our heads against it. You know, I'm still, like, a little dazed from some of it, but then watching, because it was the struggle that it was, there were a lot of ideals that we had that we had a hard time putting into practice. Dealing with groups is difficult. Trying to figure out, when you're like still trying to figure yourself out, how interpersonal dynamics work, how groups work, like how all of the insanity that can result in like tight-knit, like just the energetic feedback loops that happen in magical societies, the empathic stuff, like the kind of like, you build something up and it just implodes on itself because you're actually all too close. That was a really steep learning curve for us. So like we went through a lot of crap to do it, and we made a hell of a lot of mistakes. And we did exactly what we're supposed to do with that. We left a legacy where someone else could learn from that and go, I'm not going to make that mistake. I'm not going to make that mistake. You know, it sucks being the older sibling, but it is incredibly fulfilling to look at the younger sibling who's like, yeah, no, I saw you do that. I'm not fucking doing that. Like, so
Booger face.
what I've started to see now with what I'm thinking of as the next generation of vampires is, first of all, values that I've always held to. When I rewrote The Black Veil, like, let's not pretend. The Black Veil initially, because all of that did start in the LARPing community, it was just the traditions of the masquerade. Like, when I rewrote it, it was a thinly veiled version of the traditions of the masquerade. It was just the house rules, like everybody who LARPed had house versions of it. That is what it was, that is what I rewrote. You can see it because you go point by point with the values. The thing is not all of those are terrible values. Hospitality, respect, and, you know, so changing those values, that idea of hospitality, the fact that, like, I know I can go anywhere in the country, and if I can find my tribe, they will give me a place to stay. And if there's somebody who comes to where I'm at and they need that, we really value holding one another up. That we respect the person and the people who do the work. That we respect the people who also provide for us. You know, it's not just a vampire community. You don't have vampires without donors. You don't have vampires without people who feed them. And that we hold value for that. And what I see with the events, because vampires are, as much as we are, solitary, predatory, whatever we want to call ourselves in our darkest hours, we're social beings. Many of us gravitate to urban environments because that's where people are. It makes sense. We go where the people are. And so it also makes sense that we build events, that we create pageantry to draw people in. And the best value I have seen people take out of that is to do it responsibly, to do it in a way that it is self-sustaining. I have so much respect for anybody. As somebody who has been in the metal scene and somebody who has been in the paranormal scene and like all of these different fringe things where you've got people who are, event promoters are usually the biggest dicks on the planet. Like, if they're not assholes, they have like these enormously high expectations that they want to do. And then their reach exceeds their grasp. And seeing people who actually know how to do that right, who can balance the books, who can make something that is sustaining and not always in the red, people who will fucking pay their talent.
Hear, hear.
Savannah. Paying talent.
Yeah, no, like actually taking care of the other people who are doing the work for it. To see this actually grow into a healthy, or as healthy as it can be, given, you know, you had people, there's always going to be bad
Can't pay
apples.
the bills on exposure.
Yeah, exactly. But that we know that we, you know, a leader's role is you create the space, but you make sure you lift everybody else up too. And that we try to create things. What do we value? We value art, we value hedonism and decadence, we value our freedom. So create communities and then also create charities where we help to keep that in the world. I mean, we want to be in a world where we're not going to be shot on the street. We want to be in a world where we're not going to be arrested just because we look like we look. We want to be who we are without apology and without fear. And what I see is a community that is has really started to, one, learn that, to protect one another, and to realize that we do have to play by the rest of the world's rules, which means learning business sense, working with the police when we have to, and involving lawyers if we have to. Like, it's everybody else's right. I mean, why does the Westboro Baptist Church get to do it? Why do those assholes get to do it when we can't? So building this community, and where I think we're going from that is like a much more conscious awareness of, if we don't fight for ourselves, no one's going to fight for us. And if we don't take care of one another, no one's going to take care of us. And not sitting in a corner writing bad poetry about it.
You're not emos.
Why not both?
I was that guy. I mean, I'm not going to lie. So, you know, as someone who helped in my small ways to build this, to like knock some of those walls down and to put some of those values out there, to see it grow and to see something that I think is going to continue to grow as long as everyone continues on the path that they're on. And you know, as the world around us changes and we get more comfortable calling bullshit, calling abuse what it is, speaking up, protecting victims, making sure that, you know, just because we're vampires and vampires are predatory doesn't mean that we have to be assholes, doesn't mean that we have to be predators of the people that we care about. You know, we've got a dark streak, but I think that that just means that we should be more responsible with it. We have a lot of power.
Absolutely.
So thank you, and thank you. And really, like, give it up for the folks, you know who they are here, who help build the communities that you participate in. Texas, for fuck's sake.
I didn't even see that coming.
No, I mean, it's as unlikely as Ohio. Like fucking Ohio. How many goddamn vampires are in Ohio?
How about we have the Houston King, Queen, the Dallas King, who
Yeah.
can stand up.
Stand up.
Here.
All of you. That's what happens. We know it. We know it. I know how much sacrifice and how much determination and how much dedication goes into doing what you do to provide spaces like this. So, thank you.